Good evening from New York. This is Monday, October 3rd, 400 days until the 2012 presidential election. And while Congress returns from recess to dither over program cuts and President Obama's jobs bill, what began as Occupy Wall Street here in New York has become a national movement. With only this as a specific mantra: we are the 99% and we are too big to fail. Many are inspired by that thought and the belief that while 1% of the country may hold an enormous share of the nation's wealth, the other 99% might be able to change that through direct action on the nation's streets. Fifth story on a special edition of Countdown, also the fourth and the third, the Occupy movement, now appearing in a city near you, inspired in part by the Wisconsin protests opposed to union-busting Governor Scott Walker, and the freedom movement across the Middle East known as the Arab Spring. Nothing more direct than being accosted by a flesh-eating zombie in New York's financial district. Occupy Wall Street showing a sense of humor, making up as corporate zombies today. The living dead not looking to eat the living, not this time, not when so many delicious greenbacks will do. And in Manhattan's Zuccotti Park, to entertain the protesters, a figure from demonstrations past. Of course, Peter Yarrow of Peter, Paul and Mary singing a song that was a hit, albeit originally for the Kingston Trio, in 1962. And if flowers in this case are progressives willing to take to the streets, and the number and scale of this weekend's protests mean anything, the flowers seem to be coming back. In Boston, where hundreds marched near the Federal Reserve Bank yesterday, and more protesters marched today. In Durham, North Carolina, where hundreds inspired by Occupation Wall Street gathered yesterday to protest income inequality.
I think that part of the problem is that we just have a small percentage of people in the United States who own the majority of wealth, and they also own the majority of power to make decisions that affect other people's lives.
In Albuquerque, New Mexico, Saturday, where more than 500 protesters marched in solidarity with Occupation Wall Street, and in Denver, where protesters gathered at the state capitol to shout their opposition to bank bailouts and, more importantly, to corporate greed. But the biggest of the weekend's demonstrations took place Saturday in New York, where protesters looking to march across the Brooklyn Bridge were met by a phalanx of police. What happened shortly thereafter is a matter of dispute and of some urgency. Some of the demonstrators surged across the pedestrian walkway in the center of the bridge. Many more tried to cross on the roadway to Brooklyn. The NYPD says it warned the protesters they would be arrested if they crossed on that road. And in fact, the police department released videos on YouTube showing a supervisor saying just that.
I am ordering you to leave this roadway now. If you do so voluntarily, no charges will be placed against you. If you refuse to leave, you'll be placed under arrest and charged with disorderly conduct.
But in a video shot and released by the protesters themselves, the supervisor's instructions can't be heard over the protesters chanting. When the police then turned and walked up the roadway, hundreds of protesters followed. Some thought they were being escorted across. Instead, some 700 were arrested. Many said they thought they had been tricked into following the police. Let's start our coverage tonight with some conversation about the Battle of Brooklyn Bridge. And I'm joined by Ryan Devereaux, reporter with the radio and TV news program Democracy Now! Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me on, Keith.
All right, so you were there and you saw what happened to the demonstrators. It essentially also happened to you, at least for part of the time. Do you know, did the protesters always intend to cross the bridge on the roadway as well as in the walkway, or what was the intent? Any idea?
Well, Keith, I was at the front of the protest, at the front of the march, I should say, as I approached the entrance to the Brooklyn Bridge on the Manhattan side, and there was disagreement among protesters as to whether to take to the pedestrian walkway down the middle of the bridge or occupy the space that usually relegated for cars. This disagreement led to a buildup at the base of the bridge, and you're talking about a march with thousands of people. It built up quickly. There was a chant of off the sidewalk into the streets. That chant got louder and louder. I did see the police take to the megaphone, but that chant was deafening. There were thousands of people there. And it was clear that the police couldn't keep those numbers back. They stepped aside, and the marchers moved through onto the walkway, or I'm sorry, onto the road.
Do you sense that the protesters thought they were entrapped by the police, or was it just, is this genuinely the result of confusion and people not being able to hear each other?
I've certainly interviewed a number of protesters who feel and have explicitly said that they felt they were entrapped. I can imagine if you were even just a little bit further back than I was, you would see the police walking right next to you, seeming to escort the crowd the same way that they had escorted the crowd through the preceding blocks.
And when we say 700 people were arrested, was it, as the video we're showing now suggests, one at a time, people taken down to the pavement and cuffed or plastic cuffed? Were people penned in? How did it happen?
Well, as the protest moved its way across the bridge, we got about maybe a third of the way there to the first archway. And that's when we realized that there were policemen lined up in front of us and police vehicles in front of us, and the policemen that were on the side of us were moving up to the front. The first arrests were heavy-handed, to say the least, and they seemed to be random. They were plucking people out of the crowd, but they weren't doing it quickly. It was one by one, slowly. It didn't make sense as to how they were choosing the people they were arrested. I should say that one of the first people I saw arrested was a member of the National Lawyers Guild. He was wearing a green hat, which signifies that they're a member of the Lawyers Guild. Mm-hmm. They're there to be legal witnesses to what happens. He seemed to approach the police officers and was then cuffed and arrested. And then, to my understanding, I was released because I had a press pass, but to my understanding, the arrests that followed were more orderly and slow.
Obviously, you left this sort of in progress because of, as you suggested, they corralled you as well as everybody else. Was there only, in the aftermath of that yesterday or Saturday and then what happened yesterday and today, was there only anger by the protesters about police treatment, or was there some gratitude that once again, as with the pepper spraying last week, the police, certainly unintentionally, put the whole thing back on the front page?
Well, you know, talking to protesters after the crackdown, you know, people were stunned at the numbers, that's for sure. 700 people. When I first saw it, when I got home and looked at the numbers, I couldn't believe it. But people seem energized by this in the same way that they were the weekend before when 80 people were arrested. It drew more attention, and, you know, when people get arrested, when they spend time in jail together, when they stand up for something together, it creates a formidable bond. Yeah,
when suddenly you have the sense that you're going to be arrested for walking on what theoretically are publicly owned streets.
Correct.
Yeah, exactly. Ryan Devereaux, reporter for the radio and TV news show Democracy Now! Again, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
When protests against the Vietnam War began in the mid-1960s, academics held teach-ins in colleges and universities around the country so students could learn the history of the conflict and figure out which side they were on. On Sunday, an economics teach-in took place in Lower Manhattan, led by Nobel Prize-winning economics professor Joseph Stiglitz and Roosevelt Institute senior fellow Jeff Madrick, a regular, of course, on this program. Economics 101 and its application to our ongoing crisis from two of the nation's finest economists, supported by the now traditional chorus of protesters who repeated every word.
In the early 2000s. George W. Bush.
George W. Bush
was able to cut taxes in 2001 and 2003.
He was able to cut taxes in 2001 and 2003.
He said we would get rapid growth and job creation.
Jeff Madrick joins me now for a teach-in on what he saw and taught in Zuccotti Park, along with the Roosevelt Institute, his affiliation thereof. He is the author of The Age of Greed. Welcome back from the barricades.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
How did you make arrangements, you and Mr. Stiglitz, to go down there and teach, and why did you want to go?
You know, there are people who are aware of us down there, and they actually contacted us. Huh? It's not as if there are no educated people there or no people who read newspapers.
Thank you for dispelling that delusion.
In fact, it was quite surprising how, even to me, who did this as a kid during the Vietnam years, how courteous the kids were, how eager they were to get knowledge, the good questions they asked. I am not trying to sugarcoat this. This was a real teach-in.
Up until about a week ago, the protesters, particularly in the local press, was portrayed as this kind of incoherent group of self-advertising radicals. Did you get any of that sense? Did you get any kind of or you know, that the teach-in was going over people's heads, or they weren't interested, or anything?
No, it was very much the opposite. They were very interested. They tried to understand. We went down there because we think the facts, by and large, support their case, whether that case is built on instinct or extreme disappointment, frustration, fear. they are generally correct in the direction they're moving, and we wanted to give them the information they needed, and they wanted that information. I saw very few crazies protest for the sake of protestation.
I saw something, and we haven't had a chance to talk about it. It's only happened about an hour and 10 minutes ago. I saw something on CNN tonight that made the back of my head blow off. I had to glue it back in. A reporter went down there for her first television show in her new series and portrayed all of these protesters as being there as opponents of the bailouts of the banks and big business, and explained that since the government made interest on those things, don't you realize this actually helped the economy and helped the government? Did I miss something? Occupy Wall Street was about the bailouts? Is that true?
Occupying Wall Street is about the failure of Washington to do the right things regarding Wall Street. The bailouts did not force the banks to lend, did not deal with all these people who lost their homes and are underwater, all those things they had to. Let's not oversimplify too much. We needed those bailouts to unfreeze markets, but they were just not executed well. But there is one issue after another that these young people are interested in. They are not only talking about bailouts, but they are, in the broadest sense, talking about justice. When 1% of the people make 20% of the money, and 30 years ago they made 10% of the money, and a great recession follows, it is not a coincidence. There is a cause and effect, and I would love the people at CNN to start recognizing that, or at least have some people telling them, or their viewers, that.
Do you, in response to this, if you're watching, you said having participated in these things in earlier times on your own, when you're seeing this, there are some protests that are very specific and have a very finalized goal: get us out of Vietnam. 1,000 other, even the manufactured Tea Party one had some specific goals. That they don't have an agenda with a checklist that says we want these 23 things done by the end of the month. Is that necessary? I mean, as the old joke goes, do you know how electricity works? The answer is no. You still use your dryer and everything else, right? I mean, is there anything wrong with a protest movement that is not sitting there with a set of immediate demands?
I think there is a kind of beauty and a beautiful democracy in all of this. And it's very noticeable. There are people called facilitators. Everybody is very kind to each other. There's not a hierarchy, and yet there's an efficient system. Let's do the teach-in over here. They shout out. There are these shout-outs, these echoes, which you've talked about. Let's determine who is going to speak in which order for the General Assembly, as they call it. But there are people with a variety of their own agendas, a variety of their interests. I think in time, an agenda will evolve for some of these people. I think there will be splinter groups that follow one piece of the agenda and another piece of the agenda. So frankly, I think at some point there should be an agenda. But I must say, I was very taken with the kind of beauty of the lack of hierarchy, and yet the efficiency and the caring. You could not get away from a sense that these people cared. And when I walked, I spoke to this General Assembly, which was rather dramatic because you have this echo and echo and echo. And I walked off and these people would just say, thank you, thank you, thank you. And they had more dramatic speakers than I, but they were thanking me for information, for caring about them, and they in turn showed caring. I think caring about the country, and again, I don't think I'm sugarcoating this, they care about what's happening, and essentially, centrally, they are correct.
The economist Jeff Madrick of the Roosevelt Institute, the author of The Age of Greed, is always bringing light to complicated situations, this one included. Great thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Keith.